Welcome to the Southern Africa Trust webinar series, the Society Talks webinar series. Today we are on issue number 17. Just looking at that number, I think we have managed to exhaust ourselves and to exhaust you as our partners with this weekly series of conversations. We started off in May, and at the time we were concerned about the impacts of the COVID pandemic in our region, and particularly the impacts and its unimaginable challenges that it was presenting on communities that we felt might not be able to survive. We didn't know what we were in for, but we could anticipate what the impacts might have been, particularly as we observed the responses that a lot of governments were putting in place, the lockdown measures, and the extent to which they were excluding a lot of communities who either come from poor socioeconomic backgrounds or are engaged in the informal sector, migrants, small-scale farmers, and a number of groups that we outlined. Having gone through a series of conversations that were aimed at contributing to the public discourse and also bringing the experiences of citizens to come and share their lived realities, we have decided that in today's session, we will have sort of a virtual fireside conversation. And from this conversation, we really just want to draw out some of the lessons that we have learned and some of the key recommendations that have come from our partners and what we may want to frame as the citizens' call to action. I have with me two colleagues who are joining me in this conversation, Christabel Piri, who is our program officer, and she leads our work on agriculture and trade, as well as civil society engagement in SADC. And with her is also Malon Zakeo. And Malon is the head of programs, the head of the programs unit, executive manager for programs at the Southern Africa Trust. I'm just going to start with just asking them a basic question of what their reflections are around where we are compared to where we started off in May. What would you like to share in terms of the shifts that you have observed, some of the messages that are coming from our partners, how you have seen communities respond to COVID, and most importantly, some of the key calls to action that have come from different citizens groupings. Malon, perhaps you would like to start us off.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning, and thank you very much, Maseko, for that introduction. It's a basic question, but also big in terms of reflecting on where we started with the society talks and discussing with different partners. I know I should not have any favorites in terms of the different communities and partners that we've spoken with. But I'd say from my reflections are that in terms of crisis, our young people are our best foot forward. And I particularly have very positive recollections of one of our early editions on Society Talks when we spoke to a panel of youth from across our continent. And at that time, the mood, we were still very much as a region and as organizations, we did not know much about the pandemic at that time. We were just starting to get to grips with what it is and how it's going to affect the way we live, the way we work, and so on and so forth. And at that time, whereas many of us who are not so young anymore were in deep distress and not so much looking forward, we were consumed by what this pandemic means and what it is doing to both life and livelihood. the young people that we hosted on Society Talks, we're already talking about how to create a bigger and better future. And so that filled me with so much hope, and that's one of the biggest takeaways that I have from where we started. I would also say, lastly on this, that the feeling I have from May until August is also um, appreciating the resilience and adaptiveness of our organizations, communities, and our region. Because from where we started, there was a lot of things to grapple with. But fast forward to August, I think as societies, we've now come to terms with the reality of the pandemic. We've come to terms with what it has done, and that we are indeed in a new normal. But that new normal is not a death sentence. It's not the end of the world, but it gives us challenges that we must overcome. And we've started to overcome some of those challenges.
Mm, mm, mm. Thanks a lot for that, Malon. I think I would agree with you on what you're saying about how the young people showed up. And I think, if anything, there were a number of myths that they helped to debunk there. This whole notion that young people's capacity needs to be built, and that we have to think, they really did force us to rethink what youth empowerment looks like. And like you say, if there was a place that we needed to look for in terms of sites of hope, where solutions were being driven, they were largely being driven by young people. And I think it's also a reminder of the role that young people have played historically. If we take South Africa, where we are at the moment, the liberation of South Africa was pushed by young people. We will remember the legacy of the 1976 youth movement and the uprisings at the time. And there's something there to be said about just our ability to imagine and to tap into youthful energy in times like this, and in times where we're seeking changes. I hope that when we do come back, you can begin to talk about some of the responses in concrete terms that you saw come from young people and their calls to action. Christabel, you were driving a lot of our conversations with small-scale farmers, with the cross-border traders, and a lot of the other groups that have been looking at policy responses in the region within the trade space. What were your takeaways, and what stood out for you in these various conversations?
Thank you so much, Maseko. So I think from the various discussions, one of the key things that this pandemic has really exposed is the vulnerability of civil society to external shocks, particularly if you look at the aspect of financial sustainability and having access to resources. I think it's brought us to a discussion where we need to, as civil society organizations and generally non-state actors, need to begin to have conversations of moving from a situation where we develop one funding proposal to another and start looking at how can we begin to generate resources, how can we begin to start putting in place social enterprises where it's possible. And so there's been a lot of conversations around, reduced amount of funding, obviously affecting civil society organizations in terms of their operations. But I think the second aspect we look at in terms of the funding situations is the citizens groups that we work with and engage with, how the pandemic has affected their income generation, especially if you look at cross-border traders. And we find a lot of women that are engaging in cross-border trade not being able to go from one country to another to buy produce. So it has really meant that there has been no resources, but also the aspect that they cannot access any forms of social insurance, so it brings back to the discussion to say, what kind of social protection system do we have in the region, and really expose the fact that there are a lot of challenges and we need to look at having a basic system that could facilitate some level of income, basic income security for citizens, should such a pandemic ever happen again in the future. So the other aspect is really about also organizations talking about the aspect that they have not been able to implement some of the activities, not being able to interact with the constituencies that they work with, obviously taking into consideration and also prioritizing the aspect of safety, and ensuring how do they now get in touch with their constituencies and what modes or approaches could they use, and which brings another point, which is that through these conversations, one of the key things that has really come out is the gap with regards to the use of technology, and something that as civil society organizations that we need to look at. Sometimes when you are trying to connect with critical partners, you find there's a drop in connection, there's load shedding, so people just get cut off in the conversation, so I think it's been also a key area that that has really come out of this conversation. Lastly, in my introduction, the other aspect is really about policymakers and conversations with citizens groups, where now that the pandemic, as it was progressing and as more countries were getting more infections, there was obviously this excuse of policies not being implemented because of the pandemic. So how do you begin to navigate that space where you continue to strengthen your advocacy, and find ways to ensure that governments are being held to account to implement policies that need to be implemented, and obviously not defer or use the pandemic as an excuse to say we can't implement these policies because we have to reprioritize. And so how do you ensure that there's that balance, and how do we as civil society organizations continue to ensure that we are relevant and we are visible in terms of what we need to do? So I think there's been so many opportunities, the last one I would like to throw in is that there's been just this solidarity, I think, among civil society groups, which has emerged out of the discussions, people that you would not really network with. This has been an easy space to engage and use technology to actually link with various stakeholders and take the process forward. I think I'll leave it there for my initial thoughts.
Thank you, Christabel. I think you actually raised some really important critical points that came up in the various conversations, and I'd like to take them forward in three parts. Perhaps to start with what you were saying about the impact of the COVID on civil society, and particularly in the disruptions that it created for NGOs, for community foundations, for community-based organizations and different groups to continue doing the work that they needed to do, and important work as frontline organizations. You touched on some of the funding challenges that they were facing, and just to note that these were not new challenges, but were challenges that were amplified by the pandemic. And also the point that you raised about gaps in terms of access to technology. And I know, Marlon, you've been spending a lot of time speaking to what we know as civil society apex organizations within SADC, and you can explain what that means to our listeners. And if you could just unpack for us what some of the challenges they've been sharing with us are, and what you have seen come up in terms of responses and support from partners, from governments, and from the communities themselves. And then we can move on to the other issues that Christabel highlighted. But first, on that point, on the impact on civil society organizations.
Thank you so much, Maseko. I think first of all, as you asked, just to share in terms of what we mean when we say regional apex organizations of civil society. And I think listeners might know that within at least the Southern Africa region, We've got umbrella associations that represent different non-governmental organizations and social movements and informal associations. And within that, first we've got the SADC Council of NGOs, which is the umbrella association that brings together national NGOs and other thematic groups across the 16 member states of the SADC region. And with SADC CNGO is the Southern Africa Trade Union Coordinating Council, which brings together the associations of workers of our region. And then the third partner within that regional Apex Alliance is the Economic Justice Network of the Christian councils in Southern Africa for KISA. So the faith-based organizations, trade unions, and NGOs have come together to form this regional Apex Alliance that then brings together the affiliates from national level. And with them is a sister platform or network representing social movements and informal associations across the SADC region under the umbrella of the SAPSIN, which is the Southern Africa People Solidarity Network. And so together, these Apex organizations really bring millions of voices of the peoples of SADC organized across countries and across thematic areas, bringing traders, smallholder farmers, women's associations, representatives of indigenous peoples, youth, and so on and so forth. So those are the groupings. And Masako, in terms of the issues that have been coming up, I think some of them relate to what Christabel has shared. The initial issue that came up is just the economic devastation that has been brought to communities that these civil society organizations serve. And it also brought to life to question the definition of frontline workers, and which is a fact that, of course, we celebrate our frontline health workers, but with them has also been civil society organizations in their breadth and diversity who have been doing outstanding work to support vulnerable social groups behind the scenes, and they had not yet been in many countries included in the definition of frontline workers. We saw that with the increase of such vices as gender-based violence, where we saw that without the input of civil society organizations that work to support victims and survivors of gender-based violence, our societies and policymakers would not have an adequate view of what is going on behind closed doors. And it is such civil society organizations that help to bring that up. Associations that work with smallholder farmers who are mostly
hello, I think we've lost audio from Marlon. Hello, Marlon. Hello. Okay, we've lost audio from Marlon, and Christabel, perhaps you can come in here and just expand on what Marlon was beginning to talk about in what he was sharing about what the lessons that we saw emerge in this time and how it helped us to even reframe what we consider to be frontline organizations. You work a lot with the associations that he was talking about, the excellent work that you do with X- associations and the informal cross-border traders and so forth. Would you like to share some of the emerging lessons from those groups and the role that you saw them play at this time?
Thank you so much, Maseko. So I think one of the key things that most of our partners and the citizens groups that we work with, they've had to adapt and undertake some operational and structure changes to help them to continue to serve the constituencies that they work with and be able to continue with some of the advocacy work. For one example I would give is of the Cross-Border Traders Association. So we work with the Southern Africa Cross-Border Traders Association. One of the things that they have been working and are trying to implement is to try and come up with different communication platforms to engage cross-border traders where they could not convene meetings. So using WhatsApp, for example, as one platform to disseminate information or communicate any latest updates in relation to changes that are being made with regards to regulations around trading in countries where some of the borders have been opened. So it's also the aspect of trying to facilitate dialogues through using technology. So there's been the opportunity for our partners to begin to acquire skills, around the use of technology. And obviously, as the Southern Africa Trust, we've been there to assist our partners if they need us to facilitate a meeting. We've been able to assist and then help them to facilitate conversations and dialogues. The other aspect has obviously been looking at different avenues to access some resources, and then looking at the local level, what are the opportunities at the domestic level to access some funding. For example, for cross-border traders that don't have access to social insurance, what are the mechanisms that have been made available and how do they begin to position themselves? So one of the things has been to try and update their membership base for like cross-border traders so that should an opportunity arise, they have that information ready to say, these are the numbers of members that we have in the National Association. And if there's opportunities for funding to support like cross-border traders to recapitalize their business, then they're able to provide that information. So it's been looking at ensuring they update their membership database, but also to look at different activities that cross-border traders can engage. So in the event you cannot cross the borders, what income generating activities can cross-border traders engage with? So for example, in developing basic personal protection equipment like making masks, they've been trying to explore those activities that where funding is available, they begin to look at different ways in which cross-border traders can begin to generate some income in the meantime to help them to recapitalize their business. We also work with miners associations and migrant mine workers associations. So that has also been a change with regards to their ways of working. If you look at mine workers in the different countries that we work with, for example, Eswatini, Lesotho, and with the lockdown measures that were put in place, the associations like the Southern Africa Miners Association had to find different ways of how to reach out to this very vulnerable constituents. Most of them miners have contracted occupational disease, and in the context of the pandemic, it even makes them more vulnerable. So they had to look at different ways of how to communicate with their constituencies and trying to assist them to ensure they have access to healthcare, even if the lockdown measures were put in place and travel restrictions, like engaging with governments to say, how do you support this constituency? Because they are a special constituency. So we've seen our associations engaging governments, trying to get some exemptions and to find ways of assisting these miners to be able to access healthcare at a local level. So these are some of the initiatives that some of our partners have had to put in place in order to support the constituencies that they work with at a local level. And also, there's been a lot of collaboration and partnerships that have been established, especially with the private sector, where some of our partners have been working with private sector and getting some support to help the communities. For example, the miners, the major need for the mining community was access to food. You know, most of the people, because the miners, when they go back home, most of them are not engaging in any income generating activities. And through this pandemic period, the basic need that they needed was just access to food. And our partners have been trying to work towards ensuring, talking to different stakeholders, how they can best support the mining communities to just have a basic, to be able to access food and meet, also have the, be able to access the nutrition that would help them to get better in relation to some of the occupational diseases that they contracted. Yeah.
Thank you, Christabel. Again, another example of just the agency that exists within the groups that we work with, the social agency that exists. And you are beginning to talk about ways in which the different groups found avenues to engage with governments and also to develop relationships with the private sector. Before I shift the discussion, the last 30 minutes to like the more policy oriented lessons that we saw emerging, I just wanted to give Malone an opportunity to finish off what he was sharing earlier about lessons coming from civil society, both in terms of the NGOs and social movements that work at the SADC level. Marlon?
Thank you, Maseko. And yeah, so I think I've also just been experiencing the reality of the current times on internet poverty and digital inclusion. And I think that's also one of the things that colleagues from civil society and social movements have been sharing. That in our context where policy making and a lot of social engagements, including even traditional things such as marriages and funerals, have moved to digital platforms. One of the key threats we've seen is the exclusion of those that don't have access to reliable and stable sources of internet and power. And so that is something that has been, that has been shared. I think we also got lessons about collaboration, the importance of collaboration, and that no single organization is an island unto itself, and no single sector can address such a huge and multi-layered crisis as the pandemic has shown us. The impact of climate change showed it before. And so I think social movements and civil society have been voicing out the importance of increased collaboration and engagement amongst the states, private sector, and the social sector. And so I think these are the things, but also finally, Masov, I think the importance of space, operational space, that with a well-resourced civil society that has the relevant capacities to act and resources, these are not enough if these civil societies don't have the space in which they can act. Civil society needs the space to be able to support communities, to be able to advance policy proposals.
What do you mean by space?
So I think
sorry to interrupt you, Marlon. Yeah. What do we mean by space? What kind of space are we talking about?
I think space can be as basic as being afforded the freedom to carry out lawful activities of civil society organizations, the freedom for civil society to organize, to coordinate the issues, and to engage with policymakers. And unfortunately, in many of our SADC member states, the lockdowns came with heavy militarization that did not allow most civil society organizations to come out there and work with community organizations and vulnerable social groups. For those that work in the space on to address domestic violence and gender-based violence, it's been important for them to have access to people, victims and survivors that need it. But in certain instances, they were not able to do so without having certain certification or licenses or certificates to be able to move, to move around because of heavy military or police presence. And so that's what I'm referring to.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Marlon. I thought it was important for you to unpack that again, because it's one of the important issues that has emerged in our region at the moment. We have seen an increase in civic repression and sometimes even violent responses to citizens wanting to share their views, raise their concerns. But like you say, under the lockdown regulations, it was really difficult for public accountability activities to take place. And there's a lot of work that still needs to be done around tracking the resources that were mobilized as part of the COVID responses, and to track the impact, trace the money, follow the money, to look at where it actually was spent, how it was spent, and what the impact of that had been. And these are important questions that we need to ask. But also, as part of the recovery plan, the resources that a lot of governments are mobilizing, and the danger of sliding back into high levels of unsustainable debt are issues that still remain important for civil society to be able to engage in. And we know that some countries are more difficult for people to operate and express their views, and these are important issues to note. Christabel, one of the issues that you started talking about, you mentioned the deficits that we saw in social protection. And I'm reminded of at least 3 conversations that we had on Society Talks, where people were talking about the role and the future of social protection in our development, but also within the context of COVID. And there were also discussions about how we rethink the social and economic order going forward. And I would just wonder whether both you and Marlon would like to share some insights, some recommendations, and some of the key asks that you saw coming through some of those conversations. And again, a number of the issues, the recommendations that civil society was putting forward were not new, but perhaps there's an opportunity for us to have some concerted efforts around a few campaigns that see us moving aggressively forward in some policy reform or a complete overhaul of some of the policy areas. Anything that stands out to you? We can start with Christabel and then come back to you, Marlon.
Okay, thank you. So I think the conversations around the social protection system were really great. And I think as a region, as Southern Africa, we need to start looking at revisiting the current social protection systems, at a national level, and ensure that it covers everybody, at least even with some basic income security. But I think one of the key things that came out of that conversation is that who is supporting even the money that is currently going into some of this provision of some of these social grants. In many of the Southern Africa countries, it's donors that are providing resources for that. And obviously the amount of money is quite limited, but I think there is need for governments to start looking at saying, how much money can be allocated and how do we put up a system that covers a number of groupings, people who are participating in the informal economy, how do they get covered, and should such a pandemic or something similar happen in the future, then people would already had a good system that is working, and it will be just ensuring that there is more resources that is allocated and people can be supported over a specific period of time. So I think in terms of moving forward, one of the key things that we can continue to engage with our partners is to have conversations with governments around having a social protection system that is able to cover most citizens in a country, and to ensure that these systems are actually working. The other aspect, obviously, is to talk about the access to resources, and having a platform where an emergency fund or a platform that could provide some support to participants in the non-state actor sector, you know, and working with governments to say, how can we come up with a mechanism? I think these are some of the issues that were coming out of the conversations, where there is some sense of localized support. The other aspect, I think, is around that there's an opportunity for generating a lot of knowledge and information from this space that has been provided, so that to be able to get latest statistics, be able to do surveys, that there's this opportunity to harness what are the key issues that are facing citizens, and what are the challenges that farmers are facing, and how do we bring them on board. You know, most of the times governments have got a particular program in a year and things are always in a rush, but this pause has provided opportunity to actually undertake a lot of research. And I think this is where civil society organizations can begin to work together to be able to harness and information, and be able to profile some of the challenges that the different groupings are facing. So when you talk about farmers, the key issues around access to agriculture assets, the access to inputs, the access to financing, you know, the mechanisms that are in place, how do we begin to address those challenges? There's been a lot of pressure around the food systems and people not having access to food. So this is the opportunity to really look at the food systems within our region, the role that the smallholder farmers are playing, and the support that they need. How can government address that now? So I think there is the agency, you know, because many people have not been able to access food, and the food insecurity has just been enhanced in the region. So how do we then begin to push around these issues and engage different stakeholders to address the challenges that farmers are facing, so that they can increase food production and be able to generate income, and be able to ensure that trade continues to happen, and agriculture is moving from one country to another in a safe environment, taking into consideration the COVID pandemic. The other example I could give is with regards to cross-border traders as well. The access to financing, and now that most of the traders don't even have the capital because they've used up all their resources and they're not able to trade, you know, how does government come in to look at ways of diversifying and supporting women who are undertaking cross-border trade? What kind of mechanisms can be put in place so that they could support them to recapitalize their business, but also be able to diversify into other income generating activities, be able to produce, and then be able to look at the local market. You know, there's been a big push because of the pandemic to economically diversify for many countries and look inwardly to say we produce for the local market. So that is the opportunity to say, can we work with cross-border traders within the country? What can they do? How do we upskill them? And how do we look at the local market and be able to take advantage of that? You know, how do we look at value addition mechanisms and put in place those processes at a national level to ensure that products are being sold even locally than going across the border? So I think there are all those opportunities. I've got a lot to say, but I'll just end there for now. Yeah.
Thanks, Christabel. I'm sure we will be able to come back to you again shortly. Just to invite participants who are tuned in to please share any questions that you might have for the panelists. Share your own insights on what stood out for you in the 17 webinars that we've had since May, and most importantly, what you would like to see us talk about in future discussions. Marlon, back to you.
Thanks, thanks, Maseko and Christopher. I think that for me, in terms social protection, indeed became one of those major topics in our discussions on Society Talk since May. We were also seeing it amongst our different partners. I must hazard to say that even before May, Masako, including with engagements with our partners that are based in Europe. And I think one of the things that we were saying we are borrowing from work that we've done already in the past as civil society is the issue of the basic income grant. And I remember that in successive meetings of the SADC People's Summit, especially, there've been a lot of focus on articulating what a basic income grant is, what are those principles, and how states in particular should build up a system that brings back dignity in the social protection system through a basic income grant. And I think that we have had issues that have exposed the importance of building such a system before COVID-19. I think some of the natural disasters that we've seen, not least the cyclone Idai and cyclone Kenneth that hit Eastern and Southern Africa a year and a half ago, has brought together that, brought to the fore that reality. So I think the importance of having a social protection system, it, irregardless of the context, that we should be prepared. I think that's the motto of those that went Boy Scouts, that we be prepared, and that we need our societies to always have systems in place and priorities that are set up, I think, starting with the most vulnerable in our society, so that when a pandemic like COVID-19 strikes, because we know that that's a guarantee in the future. The effects of climate change are with us, and that's a guarantee in the future. It's not an issue of if, it's an issue of when. So we have an opportunity from the lessons that we have been taught to start working across sectors to build these systems, and also I think to anchor that with the understanding that social protection is not a privilege, and is not a handout, but this should be a basic component and right in any society that seeks to protect the well-being of its people. We've seen, I think, also the effect of the pandemic. When you compare countries that have long-standing social protection systems that allow people that are vulnerable and marginalized access that they fared better, because in those societies, citizens did not have to make a choice between staying alive and having a livelihood. But in most of the countries, certainly in Southern Africa, we've been facing a situation where, for many people, they've had to make a choice to say, should I choose protecting my life, or should I choose a livelihood? And you often had people say, well, if COVID-19 is going to kill me if I go out, if I don't go out to work at the informal market, hunger is going to kill me. And so that tells you that if we build our societies and our economic systems in the future, in which such things as a basic income grant are built in, then citizens don't have to make those choices. Mothers don't have to make those choices between leaving their children to go out to markets to try and sell things so that they can feed, they can feed their children. So I think let me end there and say, for me, the big issue was the basic income grant.
Absolutely,
the BIG.
absolutely. I actually like where you ended, because from your intervention and from what Christabel just said, I was just thinking out loud and thinking, if there were say 3 issues that we were thinking about being important to energize and mobilize citizens around and sustain the agenda to the end, it's definitely the issues around social protection. It is definitely around saying no to hunger and ending the plight around food insecurity and beginning to look at our food systems in the region. The current moment has just reminded us how urgent that agenda is. And then the third thing is really around the rethinking of the economic system and the rethinking of economics in the region, and how we begin to imagine our regional economies delivering for citizens and delivering for everyone. And what Christabel was talking about in terms of looking at economies and trade within a national context, but also thinking about those regional interlinkages. These are very important agendas for civil society. And then you've also talked about the resilience and the importance of building civil society infrastructure. And this is where you both began. And within that, of course, looking at subsets of actors, you highlighted the important role that young people play, and just what they were able to demonstrate in this pandemic. In the last couple of minutes of this, I want to. There was one question that we always asked, and this was, what is the future that you imagine? People's visions of the future. I will ask that question to both of you, but also to ask you if you can share your own vision of Southern Africa going forward, and the areas that you really would like for us to focus on as we rethink and we move forward. Christabel?
Thank you, Maseko. That's a great question. Well, I think one of the things that in the context of the work that we do, the future that I see is that there will be a lot of solidarity within the sector. And I can see it already happening, that there's a lot of partnership that is happening between civil society and private sector partnerships that are really emerging, and how we can work together, how we can leverage resources. So I see that unfolding in different sectors. I see smallholder farmers working with private sector entities, exploring different areas with regards to value addition. And so I can see that we are moving into that. There'll be a lot of digital transformation, making it easier for us to communicate and to work, to strengthen our advocacy work. There's also the opportunity for us to strengthen our operations and also create savings. The way we have been working in this virtual space, people will have different roles in terms of in the civil society sector, in terms of defining what a staff member will be doing and different roles. And in that way, you'll be able to make savings. So I see that the region will be working in that space more effectively as civil society organizations. And yeah, so I think there is a lot of optimism, but also I think the last aspect is around access to information. That for me is always a priority. And Southern Africa Trust have developed the Knowledge Hub, which is a source of knowledge, material, and information that we have been providing even around the COVID pandemic. A lot of information is being produced by different organizations within the region, but it's not being collected centrally. And I see the opportunity within the region of working together and ensuring that you have these hubs that have information beyond the COVID pandemic, but evidence and materials that can be used to inform policy development and inform policy discussions. And I think I'm seeing the region moving more towards that. We always talk about not having sufficient data, even around issues to do with migration. So there are also many opportunities around generating new knowledge and partners collaborating to produce knowledge, and us as Southern Africa Trust providing that hub and that platform that all our strategic partners and constituencies that we work with can be able to put that information, and it's accessible to key stakeholders such as policymakers. So I think I'm optimistic of the future, and I think there'll be a lot of joint work that will be done, including working with policymakers. Yeah.
Mm, mm, mm. Thank you, Krista. Malan?
Thank you. I think, yeah, for me, I'm looking to the future with a lot of hope and optimism, just based on the lessons that we've learned. Um, and I mean, it's a lot of issues. I can just start with the Southern Africa that I saw the evening in which the Southern Africa Trust and Subscene and Sounds of the South collaborated to do the SADC Arts and Music Festival. And I thought that for me, the vision of SADC is a SADC that belongs to its people and its citizens, where its citizens are united in celebrating our diversity, but also our common interests. And that, I mean, we were united for that evening by a common language, which is music and art. And I think that whereas we have made progress as SADC. I mean, our civil society partners were marking, and governments, 40 years of SADC. We have made some progress in terms of the economic and political agenda, of course. But I think it's time also to stop and think about progress in terms of the social or people-to-people agenda. How much have we integrated as a Southern African people? And so for me, this thing, when our borders have been shut and people have been locked up in different neighborhoods, it just reiterated the importance of a future in which you could see that people miss each other across neighborhoods, across townships, across provinces, and definitely across borders. And so that virtual platform and the Music and Arts Festival, for me, gave me sort of a glint, and the feedback that has been coming from different actors on that platform, that we need to be doing this every single year. And hopefully, once we have defeated this pandemic, we will have this in person where you celebrate the culture and art from Lesotho, from Eswatini, from Mozambique, and so on, and you know, and so forth. So for me, that would be the first thing. I think the second issue is that COVID helped us to pierce the veil and silos in which we live. We often pass homeless people without noticing in the fast-paced world, but under lockdown, and in most countries, when there was efforts to start, in South Africa for sure, to start to when government efforts were to go and locate homeless people, and people were living out under bridges and so on and so forth, you could start to see the level of desperation and inequality that we have in our societies. The difference between healthcare facilities that are accessed by the privileged parts of our society and those without. And so for me, I'm looking forward and dreaming of a Southern Africa that is definitely much more equal than what we have, where a hospital that is good for a successful businessman is also good for a factory worker or an informal trader. I think a Southern Africa that is self-reliant, we've spoken about the importance of food security and nutrition security. A Southern Africa that is self-reliant, that is able to feed itself in a safe way, that banks on the traditional practices and knowledge that has always fed our people. I think we definitely learned how to fall back on what our traditional culture has already given us. I think we also learned, and for me as well, the importance of, as I mentioned in the first place, people that we normally don't regard as frontline workers, how to change the definitions that we have put. I think essential workers, we've got to understand that people who work in the retail sector are essential. They are part of a value chain that is important, because without them, there's no food for our children, and there's not all those essential goods. The role of women as carers, women as professionals in the health sector, but also when we were hearing about the cases of gender-based violence, that tells you at least the future that we don't want to see, because under COVID, those issues have been amplified, those cases have been on the increase. The issue on education, everybody, even those who were not really following the progress of their children on education, when suddenly parents also became teachers at home, we all started to get to understand and get to know more how our teachers cope and what kind of work they go through when they are educating our children, and what we need to do as our children were now learning at home. We were seeing what they go through, what they need. And so we were also learning about what we need to do to strengthen our education systems so that we have the future of our societies, secure. And then finally, I think for me is the role of communities, that when everything is said and done, a major disaster like this goes back to say solutions come from the community. And if we don't have strong communities, if we don't have strong community organizations, we are not able to stand as countries. So it's important to make sure that we invest in strengthening the community-based, the humble community-based organizations, the humble community foundations that are supporting a lot of those that are vulnerable and that would normally not be seen, and that are having information and data that allow, or that should allow policymakers to make decisions that makes sense. That's my dream in the recovery. Is quite a lot, but yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Marlon, and also thank you, Christabel. I've actually been energized by just listening to your reflections at the start of the conversation. I was saying to you and the panelists that we have managed to exhaust ourselves through this series of 17 dialogues. But I think what is coming out clearly is that this was not a wasted space. It was not wasted time. It was actually a very important space for us to reflect and to capture the ideas and the insights and the aspirations of citizens, particularly because where we started off was an agenda that seemed to be purely state-driven and locking out, both physically and in virtual terms, so to speak, citizens' voices. And it was important to provide that space for people to share insights on their lived realities, to speak up on the solutions that they would like to see on the ground and what governments might be overlooking. And often we get so caught up in the hamster wheel of doing things, talking, and not taking time to pause, to reflect, to draw lessons, and to think about how we move forward. And today's conversation was really useful for us to just pause and reflect on what has come out so that we can shape the future direction that the Society Talks platform would take from now on. In our private conversation before we went live, we were talking about how we would like to go into forward-looking conversations that are about finding solutions, society finding solutions to the current challenges and reclaiming the space as citizens to put our voices where they matter. And the next round of Society Talks would really be focusing on some of those policy recommendations, some of the lessons, the alternatives that we want to see play out. From your interventions, the message is clear: inequality is unsustainable. It is not good for business. It is not good for society. It is not good for our peace and security. And definitely we do not want to see it in the kind of future that we envisage for our region. And lastly, Marlon, what both you and Christabel said about the role of communities, and people-centered approaches. With that, we would like to stop here. And next week, when we come back, we will announce on the frequency of our future Society Talks webinar series and the topics that we are going to be covering going forward. Thank you so much, colleagues, for your great insights. And thank you to the participants.
Thank you.
Thank you.